So any questions at all? Yes?
Do you think that you can really precisely design this part of post-production, sorry, pre-production?
No.
So you just have to be tangible.
You have to be flexible, completely flexible. You are always building the pyramid. That's the important thing to remember. You're always adding stuff to it. We're going to get back to the details of that, but actually you're probably only doing one tier at a time. But whatever information you actually have, you should try to put in as quickly as you do have it. You remember the MDA exercise? Put your aesthetic at the very top of the pyramid, in a sense. The aesthetic in itself is not a deliverable, but everything that you do in the pyramid is what the pyramid is going for, right? So that is what you're going for, and every tier should probably be evaluated in terms of what the aesthetic is that you're going for. But yes, you're continuously adding new detail all the time, and the higher in the pyramid you get, the more abstract it becomes. Because you're like, yeah, well, it's gonna be some stuff up there, I don't know, we'll see if we get that far, right? It's pretty standard for that to happen. Yeah, sure, we want to have vampires in the game, but speaking of vampires, I actually got an excellent question from Given just now about the advantages of doing vertical slices and horizontal slices and vice versa, right? So one reason to do a horizontal slice is you get a feeling for the entire flow of the game. You remember how I mentioned that dynamics is really, really difficult because everything affects the dynamics, everything affects how the player plays the game. Well, I have to use the example of Skyrim, which I'm playing right now or have just played. So how many people play the Elder Scrolls Skyrim? So yes, OU geeks. Anyway, so everyone played Skyrim. Excellent, that's a very good point of reference. I think Skyrim is the best example of any game that I played recently of why it's important to work with a horizontal slice. Okay, first of all, I'm playing on console. Shame on me. I know it's bad. I don't have a PC that's good enough to play it with all the mods and stuff. A consequence of playing it on the PlayStation 3 is, there are obviously some technical drawbacks and what have you. Some of them are very tedious. We're talking about really long loading times and the UI that is not really that flexible. Now, to use the example from the conversation just now, when I play Skyrim, when I play any Elder Scrolls game, because I'm old, since Daggerfall, I love the idea of kind of making my own character classes that was just kind of combining all kinds of stuff. I love the idea of saying, I'm going to go for stealth, so I'm going to sneak, I'm going to backstab at least once, and then if the guy's still alive, I'm going hardcore sword and shield. Or maybe, fire magic or something. Now that playstyle in Skyrim on console as I was playing it absolutely sucks. It absolutely sucks. It doesn't suck from a mechanical point of view, it sucks from a dynamics point of view. Why? Because like I mentioned, UI sucks, for instance, right? So because the UI sucks, I'm spending so much time inside menus when I go from backstab to sword and shield, to fire magic and scrolls and potions and whatever else I do. I spend so much time in menus that it becomes tedious. It becomes annoying, it becomes frustrating. And when that is the case, I start playing the game differently just to avoid that. As a game designer, how do you balance that? How do you balance against UI issues? Mathematically, it's balanced, right? It's fine, everything is perfect. Backstabbing does extra 15 if you have the perk and everything's, that's not the problem. It's not a mathematical issue. It is related to the terrible UI, and in some instances it's the loading time that it comes down to. These are technical issues. How do you balance against that? You can't when the least tedious way of playing the game is to go full-on dual-wielding barbarian. Right? That is how you need to play to not spend half the time in menus. That's horror. How do you balance against that? And you have all these systems that are excellent and you can make this super flexible play style, which sucks because you have to spend so much time in menus. Another thing that happens is you spend a lot of time going back to town to sell stuff all the time, but because the loading times are so long, you find yourself going to the one town that has the smallest amount of shopkeepers who are inside their buildings, because you don't want to go into their buildings because that's another 30-second load time. So you start actually making traveling decisions based on loading times. Is that a good way of keeping someone inside the aesthetic of the game? No. That's a horrible way of doing that. So that's another reason why it's so important to have a horizontal slice. Because if you were to play just a dungeon in Skyrim in isolation, without worrying about any of this other stuff, right? The only thing you care about is you have one play style and you never have to go back to the shop to sell stuff because you're packed with too much things. So if the only thing you care about is killing all the monsters in the dungeon, then the dungeon seems fine. It is only when you add the other stuff that the game starts to suck. So that's why you need to do the horizontal slice. Just wanted to mention that. So moving on to the next segment, I'm going to try to breeze through this a little bit because I think you've kind of got the gist of it, and I want you to try it anyway. So obviously I want to tell you about building the pyramid because I'm Swedish, and Swedish people can't just sell you something. We also have to give you instructions on how you build it, because that's the IKEA way. Anyway, I'm going to kind of rush through this, but I almost forgot something a little bit important. This whole pyramid thing that we've been talking about is actually useless. Now, what do I mean when I say useless? I mean useless in the way that the visualization that I have been using is a really good way to illustrate the actual concept. But it's not the most flexible thing. I mean, thinking in super practical terms, that thing was almost already full. I couldn't really add that much to it. So you need to find your own way of illustrating this stuff. Well, sometimes I have something that I call a TPBS that I've been showing. I'm not going to show it this time, so don't worry about that one. But that's one way of illustrating it, where basically you can take a mind map, and you take a mind map and you just add nodes and you make a pyramid that way. But you can also do it like Excel spreadsheets. Anyone use Handsoft or Scrumworks or any of these things? There are so many programs, a Microsoft Project, there are so many different, should we say, project management softwares that you can use. The whole point is to just divide everything as if it were a pyramid, but it doesn't have to actually look like a pyramid. That's just a mental model. So even if all you have is multiple bullet point lists, where the top level bullet point is a user story that says the player can fight, and the next level is the player can fight in this way or this way or this way, and then there's another level. That's another way of doing this, right? So just to kind of illustrate that it doesn't have to follow, my silly pyramid visualization. Now, how do we build this? First, you write your high-level design documents. Now, before we go and talk about documentation at all, like I mentioned, I'm not really that big on documents. I don't think that you should spend too much time on documents, but you're probably going to end up with some documentation in there. It's just likely. You're going to see several different types of documentation in here that you don't actually need. I'm putting all of them in here because some people like more documentation, some people like less. But if you only do one kind of documentation, that is still fine. In the end, it's all just code and assets anyway. So whatever documentation you need to make your deliverables, to make your bullet points, to make your tasks, that's all you need. So when I talk about high-level design, mid-level design, and low-level design, if you don't use that distinction, that's fine. So don't take it as me saying you need 3 different levels of documentation. Anyway, the first thing you want to do is you want to write your high-level design documentation or whatever, right? Pretty straightforward. Next up, you want to compose features in a backlog. So you take your high-level design documentation and you kind of break that down into features like player mechanics or opposition and AI. So like we did before, you take these and you just break these down into features. Right? And then you put these in a backlog. So you could say stuff like, the player can do X1, X2, and X3. Or Y1, Y2, and Y3, however you write your task lists or backlogs. That's completely up to you. Next up, I would suggest that you set your priorities in tiers, right? So you have your backlog already, and then you set your priorities. Now, this is visualized as saying x1 goes down here, x2 goes here, and x3 goes here, right? So like we said, these are our feature tiers, right? But again, this is just a theoretical construct. What this could actually mean is this might not even be a separate document. This might just be adding priorities to your backlog, right? So this is, again, just a mental model. Next up, you do your mid-level design documentation, if you're going to do it at all. And then basically the same thing. You just add more detail. You just add your subsets, pretty much, feature subsets, like we said. Same thing, low-level design, yada, 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 right? And you put that in the backlog. Now, I'm going to stop you here for a second. So, in the previous two instances, we've written the documentation, and then we've put everything into the pyramid, right? In this instance, we are going to the pyramid, and we are deriving the low-level design from the pyramid. We're working in the other direction. So not from documentation to pyramid, but from pyramid to documentation. Why? Please let someone be awake. It's back to what you were asking before, actually.
Oh, you mean foreseeing the reaction?
In a way. So what this is about is low-level design is really, really hard. It's extremely difficult to actually design stuff in very low level. Plus, it's also about foreseeing stuff. You can't always know what's going to happen very far up into the pyramid. So before you start doing very difficult low-level design with formulas and mathematics and all this really difficult stuff that's going to take you several days and several revisions and cost you a lot of sleep, you should have your priorities set already. Right? You need to know in what order you're going to be working, and you're going to do low-level design only for whatever comes next. You're not going to do low-level design for product tier 5, which is 6 months from now.
It's because of the dependencies also.
There you go. Because you might as well just do low-level design in the order of implementation, right? Do it that way, because there's nothing that breaks faster than low-level design. So if you do low-level design today, by tomorrow, you've implemented some stuff that breaks it, and you've wasted work. You do low-level design ideally 1 week before you plan the tasks. I mean, that's how tight I would want it. You still want to have your high-level design to go all the way to the top of the pyramid, if possible. But your low-level design, one product here at a time, if that. Incidentally, one of the reasons I developed this system was because I was the only designer on a product that should have had 3 or 4. This was the only way I could actually make anything work, by allowing myself to work on things sequentially. And the only way I could actually work on things sequentially was by prioritizing it in such a way that if I changed my mind about something, I wouldn't break everything, right? I could always go back like a ladder in a way. Oh yeah, and here's the next thing. Define at least 2 definitions of done for every mechanic, right? Very important. One is base quality level, good enough to evaluate, good enough to unblock other mechanics. So what we said about the cross dependencies, there's also the aspect of blocking. You're going to want to do certain things in parallel, especially if the project is kind of big. So you're going to want to do maybe one feature over here and one feature over here. And because of the cross dependencies, you want to not just evaluate it in its own right, but you also want it to unblock other people's tasks. So even if your task is not finished when it hits the base level, at least other people who need to see what it looks like now can continue with their stuff. Like we said with the whole thing with the crafting system, for instance. Knowing how the crafting system is going to work is a pretty good thing for the people making the items, and vice versa. Right? So at least have it at the level where the people who are working on the cross-dependent systems go, oh cool, I can actually do my work now and not have to wait for the other person. The other is release quality level, so functionality is solid and polished, and the content is non-placeholder and polished. Now, just for fun, content is not placeholder and polished. Someone who's paying attention is going, wait, I just thought this was about features. Why are we talking about content now? Here's the thing. If you think of a feature of a game, a mechanic of a game, as a deliverable, and you're doing this as an exercise in risk mitigation, you would actually be making a mistake if you don't also test the content of it. Now, you can actually launch the feature or actually okay the feature before all the content is done. So I am okay with saying that, you know, two-handed rifles as a feature is finished. I'm fine with saying that before all of the two-handed rifles are finished, but I think that you should have at least one at final quality. At least one. Only then will you be able to know that you haven't missed anything.
And also you said that the aesthetics affect dynamics. So
That's also true. That in itself is an important thing. So once you have something at a finished quality, you can see if the quality level in turn affects player behavior. Maybe the player will act differently when the weapon is finished than he did when it was just a cereal box, right? So that's obviously a factor as well. So at least try to put one item in. Another very good advantage of doing that is that it will be much easier to plan for the future. Once you have one rifle at finished final quality, then you'll much easier be able to know what the next 2 to 3 are going to cost to make. But until then, you're still just guessing, right? So. C, I would say create a shorthand version of your low-level design for the backlog. So this is basically this thing that we saw before. I like to put that in the backlog. Now this is depending on what kind of software you're using. If you're doing this in Excel, this might not be practical. I understand this. But if you're using something like Project or using something like Handsoft or something where you can have nested information, so you can have a bullet point or something that's like a link, right? Then you click that and it expands and shows you something else, then you can actually put this in the backlog. This is very, very good. No one reads design documents, right? But they will read this, right? Just put it like this, at least so people know what you're trying to make. At bare minimum, you can at least say, please, at least read this. And then you can have that deal. And if they still do something wrong, then you need to ask yourself, okay, maybe I wrote it wrong, or maybe they misunderstood it, but at least you have a point to discuss. Don't assume that someone read your whole 52-page design document, because they didn't. You probably forgot half of it. Right, so that goes into the backlog if possible. And this should be written at a level where everyone can find it interesting. Even your artists may be interested in seeing this, because it's going to create context for everything they make. And then finally, you write your detailed design spec. So I would actually start from here and then actually write additional documentation. And the additional documentation can look differently depending on what it is. It could be an Excel spreadsheet, it could be a pie chart, it could be a PowerPoint presentation, it could be whatever, right? But the thing is, you know that this is the next thing that you will be working on. Everyone's kind of agreed on it already, you've discussed it already, and only then do you start writing the additional documentation, because it's probably going to take you a week. So you don't want to sit in limbo working on something before you've done all the other work first. Be 100% sure that this is where you're going with the game and that everyone understands it, and then you can go with detailed documentation depending on what you've agreed with the rest of your team. Maybe they don't even want detailed documentation, but I'm pretty sure that someone in the hierarchy is going to ask for it. So let's look at the entire monstrosity here. So shield your eyes. God, that hurts. I know, it's aesthetically, graphically, it's horrendous, but bear with me. Let's start from the left, right? So like we said, if we have the distinction between high-level design, mid-level design, and low-level design. Let's say we remove the mid-level design and have the high and low-level design distinction. Because I think it is very useful to have high-level design. Even if you don't know all the details of what's going to happen, it's still a very good idea that the entire team kind of knows where the ambition is to go. Not what the specific implementation is, but ask a programmer how fun it is to implement something not knowing that you're going to want to extend it later. They're not going to be happy. So at least have the high-level design go as far as you can make it. And this is the fun part, by the way. This is where you don't have to care about anything. You can just go, oh, you can do that, pew, pew, pew. Get as crazy as you want, because it's not going to turn out that way. But at least you'll have an idea of where it is going. And the fun thing is, you can write the high-level design in such a vague way that you never really have to revise it. And because the low-level design, should we say, trumps the high-level design, which is the low-level design overrules the high-level design, you don't have to worry about keeping this intact. You know, maybe sometime you will want to go back. So once you're done with this documentation, maybe you'll go back to your high-level design, and you're going to want to revise it a little bit depending on what ended up happening. But even if you don't, it doesn't really matter that much, because this is just here to create the pyramid, to create the high-level user stories anyway. So with the mid-level design, if you're going to have mid-level design, then I would have it about as far as you think launch quality is going to be. So what you think is reasonable launch quality, try to make mid-level design of that. But anyway, so low-level design, as you can see, is just one product here at a time. We do one, did that work out? Cool. What is the next thing we want to do from high level? What did we actually accomplish in product tier 1? So what does that mean for product tier 2? Maybe we need to change product tier 2 a little bit based on what happened in product tier 1. Now, that is not a failure. That's how it is supposed to be. So don't be afraid of the idea that the results of product tier 1 changes the contents of later product tiers. That is the whole point. The reason we are doing this in this way is that if you have a conflict between product tier 1 and product tier 2, product tier 1 wins by default for two reasons. Number one, because it's done already, leave it alone, right? But more importantly, if it's not the most important, then it shouldn't be product tier 1. Right? Product tier 1 by definition needs to be the most important stuff, the bare minimum that the game has to be what you want it to, right? So whenever you have this kind of conflict situation, you just have to update your designs to allow for whatever happened down there, because this, in 99% of the time, is going to be what the player actually does most of the time. So of course it needs to be the most important thing, right? Beyond that, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, one of the things that I'm adding there to the right-hand side, it's a bit fuzzy, but it says internal demo, external demo, shippable. These are three questions that you should start asking yourselves after you get past the crucial stuff. You need to start asking yourselves, are we in a position where we can ship? Are we in a position where we can make a demo for our own sakes? Are we in a position where we can make an external demo, like an E3 demo or something? That is a very important evaluation to make. Make that together with marketing people, with publishers or whatever, so that when you're somewhere here in the middle of tier 3, right, and someone from marketing comes in and says, we forgot, there's Tokyo Game Show and we have to go and we need to put together a build. You're like, it's cool. We've got product tier 2 done. We have a demo based on that. You can just take that to your demo. To your TGS demo, right? It's seriously, you just need to make that assertion and just basically assess the game constantly and decide, okay, we are in a position here that we could actually demonstrate. And when that's been established, you don't have to hack together an E3 demo in 2 weeks, because you already have one. I mean, this should already be playable with a lot of content in there. We will get back to the content, though. We haven't really talked so much about that. So yeah, this goes all the way up. This one is actually even tagged as a bonus tier. I'm not going to talk too much about what that is. One thing you might notice is these little yellowish arrows that suddenly go up. So what are they? What do they do? What do I mean? Sorry? It's actually not a compatibility, no. Actually, in a sense, all of these should be compatible upwards. No, this is not it. This is actually an upwards dependency. And it's yellow, which means not really red, not really green. So what I mean by this is, since we already have a launchable product down here, if you're going to start doing upward dependencies, now's the time. I still think it's a terrible idea, but this is a better time to do it than it was before. A problem with doing that, so let's talk about what could that be, for instance. It could be that if you have your two-handed rifles and you're making a licensed game where you're using real-world weapons, maybe you're still negotiating with a certain weapons manufacturer about using their scope, their special optic scope for the weapon. And they haven't signed the contract yet. But you're like, let's start making it anyway, and if the contract, the negotiations go through, yay, and if they don't, no big deal. That could be one of those upward dependencies things where you're just saying, okay, well, this weapon cannot be shipped without that scope, and we're not sure that we can get that scope, but let's still work on it anyway. Yes.
We can say that since we are already in a shippable position, we can take some risks to.
Yes, but I still think it shouldn't be necessary, but it shouldn't be recommended, I should say, because there are other problems. One of the things here is you can inherit cross dependencies when you do that. So let's say that you're working on opposition AI3, which for whatever reason has an upwards dependency towards experimental feature 1, but maybe experimental feature 1 is dependent on experimental feature 2. Then you just bought the entire tier. So careful with that. But yeah, you could. I mean, it's a luxury problem to have. If you've gotten that far, you're fine already, probably. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So how does this cover the issues that we mentioned? Like we mentioned, the 4 really big bad issues that always happen: the over-reliance on upfront planning, the whole reducible complexity thing, the cross dependencies, and the priorities. How does it actually fix that? Well, here's your planning taken care of. There's no over-reliance. People know that we only do low-level design and low-level planning 1 tier at a time, so we're not depending too much on it, and we know that it's going to change. The irreducible complexity is handled in 2 senses. I mean, you have that at the macro level with the entire pyramid with the stacked horizontal slices, but you also have it at the micro level inside the features because they're made up of their feature subsets, right? The cross dependencies, like you see here, so that's pretty straightforward. And then the priorities, well, the entire thing is an exercise in priorities, right? So I wanted to show you something here. I can't though because YouTube. So one of the questions I always get when I demonstrate this, and they say that, well, this seems like such a formal and segmented way of doing things, and isn't this going to affect the charm of the game and the experimental features and the playfulness and that kind of stuff? And I think it's kind of a bit of a valid question. I understand why people will say this, because you're looking at everything in a very harsh and very crass way, and you're only judging stuff in terms of, how is it prioritized for the final product. I wanted to show you guys one thing that we did on the Hunter while we were actually using this method. So this is the Hunter. This game is actually, as you can see around here, this is actually a first-person animal hunting game that you're going around. Can we get audio? Just a little bit? Yep. Yeah. So this is, as I say, this is the Hunter. This is a first-person hunting game where we got crazy one night and we decided that we wanted to put a mini game inside the PDA. So this PDA is actually a device that you're using to go around and hunt animals. And me and the lead programmer thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool if while you're out there and you're waiting for an animal to shoot and you're just kind of making time fly, that you can actually play mini games, right? This was before smartphones were really that popular. I really felt like we were ahead of this is basically an endless runner or an endless driver on a mobile device that is virtual. I mean, how hipster can you get, right? This is like an extremely crazy hipster idea, and it happened in a game where we developed using these methods that I've been talking about. So how did we actually fit this in? Well, it was very simple. We were in a position where we had, should we say, a bit of a resting space, because we had just nailed a very specific product here, and we knew that we were in a launchable state, and we knew that it would not really help the game at that point to move on to the next product here, because we were going to launch and then we're going to have a replanning or whatever. So instead of working on tasks that were relevant to the next product here, we had a bucket list of crazy shit, right? We just had a bucket list of just crazy ideas that we had thought up at one point, and we thought, hey, let's take a small 1.5-week task and actually put it in there. And obviously the lead programmer, being a little bit crazy, he went as far as to actually make an API for the virtual device, so you can actually make new games for it if you want. So yeah, just to illustrate that just because you're working in this fashion and you have correct prioritization doesn't mean that you cannot put cute little Easter eggs and stuff in there. That's still cool. Just make sure that you do so responsibly. Don't do it in a way that you're going to jeopardize everything else, obviously. So yeah, now 6A, climbing the pyramid, production. So you work on the feature tiers in the product tier until all the feature subsets reach base quality. What that means is you want to use the cheapest content possible, and programmer and designer art is perfectly acceptable. So what I would recommend then, just to kind of illustrate this really, really clearly, is you take your product here and you don't work on one thing at a time and get it first to base level and then to release. I would prefer that you get everything to base level first to see how it all interacts, and then you take everything up to release level. You want the dynamics, you want the interactions between all the different components in the game, yes? And then you go for release quality. So as soon as base is approved, you don't want to postpone unnecessarily. And then you repeat this process for the remaining product tiers in the pyramid from the bottom up. So again, on-foot FPS with guns, plus covering grenades, plus dual wielding. And number 7, you just ship when the time is right. This is so obviously a stock photograph. Does anyone know these people? I don't think they actually exist. They're all a bunch of models, except that guy up there. I mean, no offense to the guy, but he doesn't actually look exactly like an underwear model. I think they threw him in there to make the entire thing feel a little bit more lively, but it kind of fails because, I don't know, it just feels a little bit, This is one of those discussions that we had when I was back at Microsoft and we were looking through their ads and stuff and saw, hey, it's really cool because you had like people of every ethnicity in there, right? So you had a white person, you had a black person, you had like a Native American person, but after a while they started like running out of people to put in there, and I'm just sitting there waiting for the first guy in a wheelchair to roll it. Like they just had to go through everything to just show how inclusive it is, and the entire thing ended up looking fake. Anyway, but wait. So this is the but wait segment, because I know that there's always someone who goes, ooh, right? So let's look at some of the gotchas or whatever you would call them. So one of the first things that I get asked is, what if features and content are not synced? So you don't want content to be blocked by functionality or vice versa. That makes perfect sense. I mean, just because you're working with this method doesn't mean that it's a good idea to have the entire team staffed up from the beginning. It's still a good idea to probably start with a little pre-production group and then add people to the staff accordingly, right? So you don't have everyone from day one just waiting for the designer to give them something to do, because that's just not right. However, what I would say is, you can consider setting up content production in the same way as feature production. You could actually have, like we have with the tiers of the features, you could actually have tiers of content as well, right? And I also mean in the sense of tiers of quality. So let's look at what that means. Tiers of quality and tiers of quantity. So at the same time as you're working in parallel, if for whatever reason you are making assets, you're making graphics, you're making whatever else, and for whatever reason the features stop coming or something is taking a little bit too long over there, well, you can always make the old stuff prettier. You can always make more instances of the old stuff. You can have more variations of the same animal or the same enemy or whatever, right? So tiers of quantity. So you can create more levels, greater variety of assets, bonus content like challenge maps. Players love this stuff. So don't always sit around. You've done your 10 levels and your 10 character models and whatever, and you're done and you're sitting around waiting. Well, you should probably talk that out and say, well, can we just add a few more levels? We've made 10 already. How about go for 15? There's no reason to just sit around not doing anything. Let's look at a case study. So like I mentioned, The Hunter was a game where we actually worked in this way. It's a good case study for when our feature output was faster than our content output. What that means is we had quite a lot of programmers relative to the asset creation. So we were heavily bottlenecked by asset creation. We had, I think, one lead artist who was basically doing in-house modeling as well as outsourcing some texture work. We had a part-time rigger and a part-time animator. That was pretty much what I had. But I also had 5 graduate programmers. Like, well, then of course we're going to tweak the design of the game to take our strengths into consideration. So the way we did it was, we knew that we couldn't actually make that many assets, so we had a handful of assets. I mean, we actually launched the game with 1 rifle, 1 animal, 1 item, like one of all the most important stuff. But we had random animal spawning and pathing. So the animals would actually, every play session, every time you play the game, the animals would spawn in different places and move around randomly, right? And we had unpredictable parameters like the animal senses. So a lot of different unpredictable parameters. At any point, something random could happen. To this day, this is what they do in lots of games. Like if you play something like Candy Crush or something, there's always going to be a little bit of a random element in there because it works. It keeps people excited because they don't know what's going to happen, right? And that gave us a large number of scenarios with little content. We had lots of people spending 1,000 hours within the first few months of playing the game, even though we only had one of everything, just because it was so unpredictable. Another one is Arkham City. I don't know if anyone played the Batman Arkham games, right? They're pretty good. So that's another really good case study. Did you know that it was actually developed this way? Actually, it probably wasn't, but I'm still going to use it to illustrate the point. People always take you more seriously when you have a big name game on the screen. But it's still a very good case study because just to kind of use some visual aid, one way of looking at it from a content and features point of view, right? You had all of Batman's features, right? All of Catwoman's features. You had all of Robin's and Nightwing's features. So one way of looking at how it all played out, before I go to that, you may remember that the game launched with, obviously all the Batman stuff, but you could also get like a small Catwoman campaign as a day one DLC. So if you bought the game on day one, there was a little coupon to make sure that you didn't buy the game used, and then you used, the coupon, and then you got like a little story with Catwoman. And then there was also Robin and Nightwing were also in there. But they kind of were used for challenge maps and they didn't have their own story. I don't know exactly how this happened, but I'm going to allow myself to speculate a little bit. What if this happened? They went with Batman, features and content, perfectly fine. No worries whatsoever, right? Catwoman, features and content, perfectly fine. Robin and Nightwing, wow, okay, so that didn't work. How did they solve this problem? Well, they basically took Robin and Nightwing and they put them in the challenge maps, and later I think they used Robin again for the DLC like Harley Quinn's Revenge or whatever it was called, right? So basically what might have happened is they had the functionality for all these characters, but they didn't have time to make levels and story and all this stuff for them, but they still had them. So why not just use them for challenge maps? I mean, really, they're full-fledged characters. You can actually play with them, and they have pretty much the entire feature set that you would expect from Batman, almost, except for the gadgets and stuff. So why not? Put them in the challenge maps. The only thing that they need to be, cross-dependent on is the combat. So just put them in combat maps, and people will think, oh, it's awesome. You can play battle maps with them, right? Now, what if content output is bigger than feature output? Well, that one's not even difficult. Let's look at a few no-brainers. Super Mario Brothers, Portal, every single point-and-click adventure game that has ever been made. You don't need that many features to make fun, deep, or even large games. I mean, the last few years, what have people been talking about? They've been talking about Dear Esther. They've been speaking about Gone Home, The Stanley Parable. These are the kind of games that people are playing. The Double Fine Adventure thing, Broken Age, whatever. All these games are content-driven games. So being in a situation where content output is actually faster than feature output should not be difficult. If you find yourselves in a position where you are making content faster than you are making features, then you should consider yourselves happy. Because having more content, if it is good content, is almost always a good idea to more players. People will play puzzle games where the maps have very little difference from one another, and they'll play them over and over and over and over again. So I wouldn't worry about that situation. So just as an FAQ section, the first question is, what are the main benefits of all this? And for me, it's bringing everyone's visions in line, because you get to play the game as quickly as possible in a way that actually is representative. So it lets the team all understand what the game is supposed to be, because as we said, they're not going to read your design documents. So if you can play the game as early as possible, that's a better way of getting people's visions in line. Imposing reductionist, minimalist design by default. What it means is you implement something, you check how the game plays, and if you have time and or are not happy and you think that adding more stuff is going to improve it, then you move on to the next one. But in many cases, you will actually find yourself saying, you know what? This feature is good enough as it is. We thought that we would have to add a lot more to it, but we can see now that that's wrong. So we're just going to leave it alone. This is extremely useful because the other way never happens. Especially not when you're doing a live game that you're actually trying out on players. How many games have you heard about where the game is launched and player feedback is, you know, I think we got a little bit too much from you? Have you ever heard this story? No, it sounds absurd, right? For a gamer to say, I think there were a bit too many levels. Sometimes they'll say stuff like, oh, I think the game was a little bit too long, but that's because you were probably dragging it out, right? That's different. But very rarely has anyone ever said, you know, I think you guys went overkill. The game is just a little bit too good. No one will ever tell you this. On the other hand, it's possible that it is a bit too good. It is very possible that you have implemented a feature that is so sophisticated, but you could have gotten away with something much simpler. The only way to actually know is by working at it one minimalistic step at a time, and when you find the sweet spot, leave it alone. Anyone in here like music? Music? Anyone? Music? Just such a stupid question. I would expect everyone to throw their hands up, right? So if you like music, think of your favorite album and ask yourselves, does that album have one song that you hate? Because there's so many albums out there that have just that one song that you wish they wouldn't have put on there, right? Why did they put that on there? Because someone decided it needed 12 tracks or whatever, right? They might as well have left. Well, this is a way of avoiding making that song that no one asked for. You work until it's perfect, and then when you add another song, when you add another feature or level or whatever that might be, and people hate it, take it out again and leave it. That was too much. Okay, bring it back down again. Obviously, it minimizes wasted work. I really want the team to voluntarily work hard towards a vision that they understand and towards goals that are realistic. And to know that for every hour of overtime, it helps take the game from good to great. Right? And you can do this if you know what the pathway is and if you see progress and it's going in the right direction. But no one wants to work overtime to go from horrible to God, just ship it already. Right? And I'm not going to mention any names, but I have seen this relatively recently where there was one team that refused to do any more overtime and caused a pretty massive delay at a certain company. And they said, we don't want to keep working overtime for a game that we don't think is going in the right direction. That's all I'm going to say about that one. I mentioned wasted work. Now, is that a big problem? Well, I remember someone writing a program once that counted the number of assets that have been created for the game and assets that ended up actually being used. Now, the number of unused assets was somewhere around 60%, unless I'm mistaken. Imagine if you had all that money back, right? That is going to affect how much the game has to sell to break even, and it's going to affect if you can still make games the month afterwards. It's very important, and there's another example that I like to use. There's a Gamasutra article on the closure of Chaos Studios, and I'm going to quote the article that said, staffers, so employees, said that the main development of Homefront was actually finished within 1 year. With the first 2 years, not the other way around, the first 2 years of its 3-year development virtually wasted on ideas that didn't pan out, including 9 months spent on a single-player prototype that got scrapped. Now imagine how much better the multiplayer game would have been if they would have done it the other way around. You do the multiplayer part first, and then when you find that your single player is not going anywhere, then you scrap it and go back and keep polishing your multiplayer. They didn't have that option, so after 2 years, they had nothing, and they got 1 year to make a multiplayer-only game. So it's lose-lose. You lost all the wasted work, and then you had to make a relatively mediocre multiplayer game in 1 year. Mind you, Chaos Studios had to close down afterwards. Everyone got sacked, so yeah. Remember, even the stuff you throw away will cost you. Let's say, for instance, that you're doing method A. You're implementing method A, whatever it could be. Feature, content, I don't care. Bam. It doesn't work, right? So you go to method B instead. Then the utility that you're getting, the use for the end user, is just method B. This creates no end user value because it got thrown away, right? but you're still paying for it. You're paying for both, but only half actually is of any benefit to the end user, right? Meanwhile, if you work my way, method A, you get cost and utility, right? Method B, you get cost and utility from both of them, right? And some people could say, well, what if you scrap tier 1? Well, tier 1 is probably going to be a lot smaller than this is, if you're doing it right. Now, if people say sometimes, oh, this sounds familiar, I don't care about being original, it's still worth reminding people about this because they don't. I meet a lot of people who say, hey, we know all this, and then I look at their game and no, they don't. It's a little bit like Darwinian evolution in nature. Yeah, so moving on. Anyway, this is my contact info. I just wanted to wrap this up as soon as possible because you've been such an excellent audience. I know how long this has taken. So if you want to do the thing with the QR code, you can just go ahead and take a picture of this. This is where I usually let people ask questions if they have any. I know it's been a very, very long day, but please take the opportunity. There is actually an exercise after this that I want us all to do. But yeah, now's the time to ask questions.
What about small teams, like less than 5 people?
Yeah.
So keeping them in line as a vision is easier than big teams.
Yes.
And how do you suggest matching this method with small teams?
I don't really think that matters. I think even having small teams, it's going to be very useful to get the game playable as soon as possible. For your own sake too, even if it's just you. Even if you're making it completely on your own, for you to validate your ideas and your assumptions as soon as possible is very important. Because if we're all intellectually honest, we don't know what's actually going to happen when the game's done. We don't know. I mean, if we want to make good games, we're going to have to risk losing a little bit of control. So for you to be able to test stuff before you spend too much time on it, whether it's testing it on yourself or other people or I don't know, en masse to get statistics, the sooner you can get that, the better. So I would still recommend people working in this way. And it can be a really good group exercise for everyone to sit down and agree, okay, this is the most important part of the game. Right? And having an agreement about that and then moving forward small steps at a time instead of looking at everything as a massive thing and having a massive argument that takes 3 weeks. So if you all have to just have a discussion over something that's going to take 1 or 2 days to prototype, I think that's going to lower the friction a lot with the rest of the team, even if it is a small team, because they'll say, okay, I don't actually believe that you're right, but I'm willing to spend 2 days to prove you wrong. But that discussion becomes more difficult when we're talking 6 months. Okay.